This is a meeting of the Leicestershire Fieldworkers. I'm Peter Little, I'm the chair of the Fieldwork group. For those of you who aren't members, we have been around now for 45 years, and we are a group of active amateur archaeologists, mostly involved in field walking, but also test pitting, geophysics, and occasionally excavation. So it's, as I say, very nice to see you all. Tonight's speaker is Ian Meadows, who spent many years working for Northamptonshire Archaeology, but has now become a consultant, Ian. Yes. Based in Bath, but as you can see from his t-shirt, if you can see that, he is showing his allegiance to Leicester there, as indeed I am. Behind me you might see the Filbert Street sign behind. Leicester City Football Club are doing very well this year, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. The theme of tonight's talk is excavations at the Roman town of Irchester, one of the small towns in Northamptonshire. Ian has been leading the excavations there and is going to tell us what they found. So I will pass over to you, Ian, if you would like to share your screen, right, and we will proceed with the talk.
There we go. Right, sorry, technology and I are not the greatest of friends, so if this goes wrong at any stage, I apologise in advance. Right, my name's Ian Meadows, as Pete said. I wear the t-shirt because I'm actually from Leicester, so I've followed a football team that's gone up, gone down, gone up and bounced around a bit. My involvement with Irchester goes right back to the early 1990s, prior to which I'd worked up and down the Nene Valley, and Irchester is one of those sites that when you start to get involved with it, it grabs you. It has a little bit of everything, and really the key part about this site, it has potential for telling us so much about the past of Northamptonshire, and indeed parts of the Midlands. It's an area that has survived as a little pocket. Now, the history of the site is that it was a working farm owned by Whitworths. And steadily land was sold around for gravel, for roads, for development, until the farm became unviable. And then in 2004, the County Council, with grant aid from the Deputy Prime Minister's office, bought the site with the intention of making a sort of heritage asset for the county, a place where large parts of the history and heritage of Northamptonshire could be displayed, talked about, demonstrated and enjoyed by the public. The site itself is focused on a Roman small town, but it also contains Mesolithic remains, 2 Iron Age farmsteads, a deserted medieval village, a 17th century gentleman farmer's house, farm buildings and landscape, as well as a sort of Victorian farm and so on. So we have little bits of everything. Oh, and industrial as well, for those that like the dirty stuff, ironstone quarrying. So we have all sorts of aspects of the heritage on this one site. It sits next to a busy dual carriageway and people fly past it at about 70 miles an hour. People equally getting the train down, going down to London, go past the site. But it's one of those little oases of sort of green and pleasantness where you can go and see, just outside Wellingborough. Now, as a site, and I'm trying to work out how my technology works now. Next slide should come. There, next slide. Now, the site, as I say, was acquired in 2004 by the County Council, but it's had a very long and checkered history. There's numerous references to the site through sort of early historical documents, historic records, bridges history of the county and so on. And it attracted the attention, as did so many of these sites, of a Victorian antiquarian the glorious Mr. Baker, or Reverend Baker, who carried out various excavations in the 19th century, some of which were, I suppose, early sorts of rescue excavations during ironstone quarrying. He records elements of a presumably late Roman cemetery, which included structures, presumably mausolea and possibly other monuments. His work, however, was largely focused on the walled area of the town, which tradition at that stage had down as a summer camp for the Romans. They presumed that the main Roman settlement was in Irchester itself, and this site was just a summer camp where they came to get the glorious views over the majestic River Nene. Now, Baker and his happy cohort of labourers that were funded to carry out excavation, and friends such as the gloriously named Mr. Fairless Barber, who was an FSA, obviously as standards in those days were easier, carry out excavation work. Fairless Barber is one of those characters that you've got to love the name, but also he was carrying out a sort of early geophysics. He was going around the site with a big iron bar and a hammer, and he was banging it in the ground till he hit something hard, and then the labourers would come along and find out what it was. So in essence, he was wall chasing. So this plan that you can see in front of you is our version from when I worked in Northamptonshire Archaeology of the work that Baker did. There's no good plans from his work, but he did produce a plan, is our version of a digitised plan showing where he carried out excavations. And you see, apart from the notable red area in the middle, most of the other elements are just chasing wall lines. Now, the excavation was of limited quality. He published things. There's 2 articles on Irchester. Unfortunately, when the County Council acquired the site, we tried to track down where all the finds and other objects have gone, because although some of the finds were in Northampton, other finds would appear to have been farmed out to specialists over the country. But sadly, we were unable to find where things like the coins and other objects had gone. A sign of Irchester and its diaspora, one of the stone coffins from Irchester is on the front lawn of Middlesbrough Museum, which is exactly where you'd expect something to be from Northamptonshire. Anyway, so as a site, it's had a very checkered history, but since 2004 and the County Council ownership, the site has been developed or been looked after, and various pieces of work have taken place. In the late 2000s, a series of modules were put together to create a sort of baseline of knowledge, and then we worked towards having an excavation on the site in 2011. Now, in 2011, we came face to face with this rather large mound of mud, not what you'd normally expect on the site, hidden under a cable drum that was being abandoned on the site, and it's a metal detector hole. You might be used to the small little pockmarks where they recover individual pieces. This was a concerted effort to take more from the site. And this is what happened when we emptied it out. Now, you can see there's a ruddy great hole there, obviously a metalled surface. We carefully excavated it. We sieved and loved the soil as we were instructed to do by the SOCO, trying to get evidence of the people who'd been doing it. We found a Mars bar, well, the wrapper. But the good thing was that the people who were doing the work on the site were actually intercepted by Historic England inspectors. They got arrested and they were convicted and given an ASBO. I went through the finds that were retrieved from their house, and sadly it was impossible to work out what had actually come from this hole. But it just gives you an idea of the level of damage that can be done by some of this illegal prospecting that does go on. At Irchester, thankfully, of late, there's been little or no evidence for illegal prospecting, and the biggest vandals are badgers. Now, in terms of the site, trying to get a baseline of knowledge was one of the key things. And Irchester was one of the first small towns where the whole town and the suburbs were completely covered by a magnetometer survey, completed by 2009. And you can see the results are actually wonderful. They're almost like a road map, where we can identify old river courses, we can identify the road network within the walled area and roads within the suburbs, we can identify Iron Age farmsteads, we can identify individual buildings within the town as well. And we can also identify the triple ditch that formed part of the defensive circuit that enclosed the town. So it was one of the first in the country where we could say we had this whole survey of the whole settlement. The area within the wall was particularly surprising. because one expected the area within the wall to have so much noise that definition of things as subtle as individual buildings might have been difficult under normal circumstances. This is where the glorious Rev Baker came to our aid. When he completed his excavation, what they did is they removed, and I quote, cartloads of stone. They basically cleared anything that was within the plough soil in order to facilitate agricultural cultivation of the area of the town. So the removal of all this detritus and noise from within the plough soil meant that when the magnetometry was carried out, we actually got very good results and were able to define individual structures and even details such as this building. I don't know if you can see the arrow of my cursor on the screen. Is that brilliant? You can see this building here. I was informed by Adrian Butler, the late Adrian Butler, who carried out the parts of the geophysics and was co-author on the report, that this structure here almost certainly burnt down. And this enhanced reading, this darkened wall, was where a building had burnt, and as it cooled down, obviously it fixed an enhanced magnetism. And we can see that clearly on the geophysics. Now, why were people at Irchester? Why come here? Well, one of the main reasons, I think, is that this is a part of the valley where the River Nene sits, and I apologise for anybody from Northamptonshire, but I did live in Peterborough for 20 years, so to me it is the Nene and not the Nen. The majestic River Nene in this area lies in a valley that's in excess of 1 kilometre wide. Now, before it was made navigable in the 18th century, this river would have occupied a number of channels across the floodplain. And because the volume of water is not that large, I think it highly likely that in this part of the valley, there would have been a ford that would enable crossing of the river throughout the year, except perhaps odd days when the river's in full spate. So I think what we have here is an accessible point that facilitated movement north-south over the river, and also you had a great wide floodplain. I think the floodplain in itself was attractive to early prehistoric settlement. The Neolithic, the Mesolithic activity we have at 2 or 3 locations on the site sit on the top of the edge of the valley, able to overlook it so they could exploit the fish, fowl, and anything else that struck their fancy. Now, from a Roman point of view, the key thing about the valley is as you come down the slope, you have a dry valley that comes right the way down onto the floodplain. So there's no scarp, there's no sudden drop off. So it made a perfect place for a Roman road to come down to cross the river itself. And you can see on the opposite side of the river here, this is a causeway, a Roman causeway that was examined by the Oxford Archaeology Unit in the 1980s, and continues the road north on towards Kettering and the rest of the Midlands. So what you have is a very good place for a Roman town to be because it's a perfect place to cross the river. And because of that, I think what we have within the town, whoops, I need to go back one, sorry, previous. I think that one of the things we have within the town that is of note, and one of the things that came out from the geophysics was this feature. You can see just a very faint line and what looks like a quite distinctive playing card corner. We think this may be the remains of a Roman fort. It's possible that with the conquest of, or the invasion of Britain, that a short-term fort was established at this river crossing to control access over the river, to manage the whole process. And of course, because you have a fort, you'd have soldiers, whether they're auxiliaries or legionaries, it doesn't matter, but they were paid a salary. And the locals would have been attracted to the idea of parting the soldiers with their money and providing them with various services. Those services may have been innocent ones like laundry or a hot meat pie. They may have been more personal services, bearing in mind these men were a long way from home. But I think that what we may have is the germ of a settlement forming here outside the fort. And I think that may give us the origins of our town. Now, next. Now, if I go back, if you look at the road network, this is the line of the main road coming through. The walled town sits on a saddle of land. It sits on a local piece of high ground. But if you take this main road, there is a looping road that comes up and round, forming a sort of D-shaped loop. Now, this D-shaped loop is something that you see on other Roman towns within the valley. This is Ashton. and you see the same D-shaped loop of road. Presumably it ran out here, coming off the main route that came through. This is another Roman town. This is Titchmarsh, and again you have the main route, and you have the settlement off to one side, presumably with a loop road. You know, you've got part of it that's seen coming off. So I think we have our settlements and we have the through road. So, you know, maybe the Romans invented the bypass. Now, what do we know about the Irchester town centre, for want of better terms? Well, it has a very interesting road layout. When we do the Romans as school children, we're always told that the Romans built straight roads. I think the obvious and my favourite example of a Roman straight road is the one that runs through Wiltshire and heads directly to Silbury Hill, and then suddenly has to swerve when, you can imagine, the poor Roman engineer looks up and goes, bloody hell, who left that there? But at Irchester, what you have is a town where you have a straight road, but a whole series of very sinuous routes, very curved and what are described as dendritic. Now, I think they're the result of the very practical natives, because I mean, we always talk about the Romans and think of people who've come from Italy, but I think these were Britons who simply adopted Romanized customs, Roman ways, lived in a town, but used practical common sense to the way they lived. And by having roads that have this curvature and run down the slope, they facilitate surface drainage. And the surface drainage wouldn't just be rainfall, just think of all the other unpleasant things that may have been draining off the surface. Now, most Roman towns, you expect to see a gate on all sides. In the case of Irchester, I believe there are only ever 2 town gates. If you go to the northern side of the town here, there's actually a sheer drop, a sharp drop of about 3 or 4 meters down onto the floodplain. And I don't think there ever would have been a gateway at that point, because you literally would have just fallen down the hill. There certainly is a gateway on the east side. There is a gateway on the west side, but the most contentious is the south side. In Baker's work, he claimed there was a gateway on the south side. I, however, don't believe there's a gate on the south side for a number of reasons. One of them being the work that was done when the A45 was duelled by David Hall, which is plotted roughly here. If there was a gate coming out from this area, one would have anticipated buildings fronting it. One would have anticipated roads running parallel to it. None of that evidence was recorded. What we do, however, have is this rather wonky building that sits perpendicular to the line that this curving road would have followed prior to the erection of the defences. So I think Irchester probably only ever had an east gate, which linked to the main road running north-south, and a west gate that ran to the western suburbs. I think that a north gate would have been superfluous, and a south gate, well, there is no evidence for it. Now, Irchester sits, as you can see, at a hub of roads. We have roads going off down into Bedfordshire, roads going up to Kettering, roads going along the valley towards Titchmarsh, and ultimately presumably onto Water Newton, a road going on to Duston, and this bit of road here running down towards Towcester. Irchester sits at this nub, and I think it's one of those key towns within the valley, a sort of communications centre. And certainly I think that, you know, what you can see there with the proposed road network reinforces that. Now, this status, this central place, I think may be one of the features or one of the factors that influences why Irchester is different to the other small towns in the valley. The other small towns in the valley include Duston, which is in Northampton, Titchmarsh, which is just outside Thrapston, Ashton, just outside Oundle, and none of those have walls around them. Irchester, however, has a substantial wall erected around it, complete with multiple ditch sequence for defence. Now, why would this town get defences and the others not? I think it's partly because it was at such a key communications node, but I think it's also because that communications node gave it a status that some of the other towns didn't have. Now, Irchester is the only one with defences. You can see here it's number 13. So, you know, it's bigger than some and smaller than others. It's quite a middling sort of town, but it's got you know, it's a decent sized town. It's certainly a lot larger than, you know, places like Dawn in Oxfordshire, or, you know, Little Chester and places like that, you know, which are much smaller defensive circuit. So it's a major civil undertaking to erect a defence like this, which suggests there was a desire to have it, a will to have it, and also the resources to erect it. Now, in Irchester, again, in contrast to the other small towns, we've got evidence for sculpture. This male torso recovered in the 19th century. We've also got this capital recovered in the 19th century. And most interestingly, we have this tombstone to Anicius Saturninus, a strator. Now, the strator was a man responsible for acquiring, purchasing, obtaining remounts for the imperial system, in particular for the imperial mail service communications. So the fact we have a tombstone for an imperial official at Irchester suggests that this town is actually linked into this whole imperial infrastructure that stretches all the way back to Rome itself. Now, the evidence for that infrastructure comes in the form of some of the structures that will have gone with it. Whoops, wrong way. And with the geophysics, we were able to look at the various buildings. We have our road frontage coming along with lots of the standard strip buildings. But just to the rear here, we have a range of small rooms around a courtyard. And it's essentially one street back from the frontage. And what we wonder is whether this as a structure might be a Mancio. A Mancio is a sort of imperial travel lodge, for want of a better term, where officials from the empire could stay safely overnight. Also where goods being transported on behalf of the emperor could be stored safely overnight. Now, we believe that may be the Mancio, and we wonder if this structure here may be a bathhouse associated with it. These are things that we'd love to dig, but currently they're just under the grass and under the sheep's feet. Just so you can see what a Mancio might look like, this is an example of a Mancio. I think if I remember right, this is the one from Catterick. They're known from a number of towns and they're dotted along the road network. The road network has a system of Mancios and also places called mutatione where people could change the horses. So your messenger would ride his horse until it needed changing. He'd change his horse maybe 3 or 4 times in a day, but he'd make sure that at the end of the day, before it got dark, he had somewhere safe to sleep overnight. So these Mancios are very key to this whole imperial communication system, the days before text messaging. So if we've got this tombstone of a strator, you know, what's he doing at Irchester? Why Irchester? Well, we think that, you know, this imperial official may actually be the tip of the iceberg. He may only be one such official. To erect something like the circuit of defences around the town suggests Irchester has a range of imperial functions, you know, not just buying some horses. I think it's likely that this town served as a regional centre. And what we need to do with our further excavations is to try and ascertain what other roles this town had that other small towns in the valley didn't have. Now, geophysics is great, and those of you that watch Time Team will know Tony Robinson thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread, and it can cure everything apart from possibly athlete's foot. The trouble with geophysics, it's largely very good at finding ditches and stone buildings, but we have to remember always that large parts of Roman towns were being dominated by wooden structures. Excavations in London and Carlisle have been really quite instrumental in showing us what Roman timber buildings can look like in an urban context. And I think it's highly likely that large parts of Irchester will have had similar timber buildings. Work at Wombre identified a type of timber building simply by lines of stones on the ground at a common height, where they presumably propped up the floor plates of a building similar to a garden shed. I've always marvelled when you look at the work at St Albans, how the reconstruction always has huge acres of gardens and nothing in it. Because the excavations carried out in the 1940s and 50s were not subtle enough to identify many of the timber buildings. But I think that, you know, one has to identify some of the gaps within this town may have had these timber structures that have left no easily detectable trace without excavation. Now, within the town, we have not just ordinary buildings, not just potential buildings, mancios and bathhouse, but we also have a range of possibly religious buildings. Here we have a group of structures, a circular shrine and a square shrine, and there is a further complex of circular and square shrine further down. Now, this particular complex sadly was visited by Baker in the 19th century, but Historic England, or English Heritage as it was still then, allowed us to excavate in 2011 on the temple that Baker had exposed. So we had the joys of excavating onto it, but not doing anything too intrusive into it. So it's one of those sites where we took the turf off, we cleaned, we loved, we photographed and recorded. And what you can see here is the classic ambulatory and Keller square Romano-Celtic temple within a courtyard area with a wall enclosing it, presumably some sort of temenos wall enclosing it from this road, which is the road that runs out to the east gate of the town. There was a substantial gate. This is one gate pier, the other gate pier just beyond, which would form the entrance into the complex. And adjacent to the temple, we had this further stone building, which, if we were to use the analogy of Maiden Castle, is the priest's house. But I think it's far more likely it's a structure in which they stored offerings and other things. Unfortunately, because the site had been examined by Baker, we found no votive offerings, no objects whatsoever of sort of religious significance. But we got a beautiful site plan. Now, that was obtained by this. This is before drones, you know, BD, and that's me at the bottom of a very long pole with a 35mm camera at the top of it, trying not to drop it. And the person standing watching me is my oldest son, who was saying, "Go on," just waiting for it to come crashing to the ground. He's a supervisor at MOLA now. Now, what did we get from the site? We recovered evidence of the Antiquarians. They obviously had very good lunches, so we found a trouser button. We found the remains of roofing that had presumably slid off either the temple or this ancillary structure. You see the roof tiles. This area was littered in tegulae and imbricae. We found the remains of the base of the wall plaster, literally the bottom dribbles of wall plaster on the walls of the temple. We found that the courtyard outside had at least 2 surfaces of limestone and gravel, quite heavily tamped down, and it was littered with oyster shells. Quite clearly, they, you know, either consumed huge amounts of oysters as a snack when meeting God, or they'd made offerings of oysters, a food offering. We don't quite know. But this area was littered, both layers were littered with oyster shells. And what we also had was this rather nice rectangle of mortar. We believe that this may well be the base of an altar. For those of you that aren't familiar with a lot of Roman temples, what you wouldn't do is sacrifice a live animal in a confined space. And the altar for sacrificing is generally outside. So it is quite possible that within this courtyard area, there would have been at least one altar, possibly another one on the opposite side of the gateway entrance, on which the offerings, on which the sacrifices could take place, presumably also allowing the priest a place to escape if the goat kicked off. After we carried out that excavation and recorded it and loved it, it was duly buried under terram and soil, and there's literally only about 6 inches of soil over the whole site, but it's preserved for future generations or for future work where we might be able to go back and carry out further research into that part of the site. That's an artist's reconstruction of a temple or shrine of this sort. I have to say, I always think they look like public toilets from the 1930s in parks, but it gives a visual impression anyway. Now, the other excavation we carried out in that same stint was down in the northeast corner of the site, where at that stage travellers' horses had eroded a huge hollow around the drinking water trough. There was concern from Historic England that these horses would have caused erosion and be damaging the archaeology beneath. So we put in a single trench that ran across the line of the defences and extended it into and beyond the hollow that the horses had created. Now, what we found was the horse hollow was still a good 30 to 40 centimetres above the archaeology, so that was reassuring. We found that we'd got the remains of Roman buildings, we had the remains of the Roman defensive wall, and we had a massive amount of colluvial soil. This is all that remained of the Roman wall. We're not quite sure when it was robbed out. We know elements of the defences were still visible in the 17th and 18th century. So it's possible that this wall was robbed out at that time. It's equally possible it happened earlier, but all that was left were nubs of stone and bits of mortar, to the extent where myself and one of the supervisors on site, we were debating whether it was actually a robbed out wall or the remains of a footpath. It's that grotty and that thin. Now, the aspect that most intrigued me was this wall, however. The wall, you'll notice, is 2 courses high here, and then it suddenly stops. It stops where it is cut through by the Roman defensive wall. And that's not the only building that got cut through by the Roman defensive wall. There is another, if you look at the geophysics in this top corner. If you look at that little triangle, that's what's left of a building that was in the way. So you can imagine the Roman officials deciding that this town needed a circuit of wall, probably in the late 2nd century, going around knocking on the household doors saying, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Claudius, your house is in the way of progress." And then the wall would just go straight through their living room. So we believe that these buildings would have been levelled and abandoned to allow the defensive circuit to go through. Now, the other reason for me lingering on this slide is earlier you heard my love of the badger. My love of the rabbit is equally strong. For those of you that get tearful at Watership Down, look at the depth of these rabbit burrows. This is the equivalent of a nuclear bunker for bunnies. They have burrowed down the best part of 4 foot into the archaeology. And indeed, they go under the defensive wall. So, you know, nothing stops wildlife when it has a mind. Now, those 2 sallies into the scheduled monument area were in order to facilitate management of the monument. The monument no longer has horses grazing on it, they're far too damaging. And as part of its current management regime, the area is grazed by sheep who have delicate little feet. We, subsequent to that excavation, carried out further work around the farm and in the orchard and the lower garden. Now, at this stage, there was no grant for the redevelopment of the site as a heritage asset. Although the County Council owned it, they were at that stage still applying to the Heritage Lottery Fund to try and get money to develop the site further. So we carried out a season of excavation in, sorry about this, just a quick double check to get my dates, in 2012. In which we carried out an excavation with that unlimited labour force, school children. We opened an area up within the orchard and we had parties of school children come and spend the day with us. Some of the children will carry out excavation work, some of the children will carry out fines processing, and some of the children carry out other related activities to the site. Here we are opening up the area, and here we have the joyous childish faces on site. Some of them really got into it. Some of them screamed every time they decapitated a worm. And 1 or 2 of them were wearing expensive trainers and sort of leggings or whatever, and tried to hover over the mud, a technique that none of them mastered. But it was a great experience for all of us because first of all, we learnt how to deal with children on site. We learnt what worked, but rather rewardingly, a number of years later on one of our subsequent excavations, one of these same children, not necessarily ones out of this particular picture, visited the site bringing his parents with him. And the fact that many of these kids are actually engaged in this project from when they were at school is one of those very nice things, because archaeology should not be remote. I think it's one of those slightly depressing things that many people in the general public will quite happily go to a site or a museum when they're on holiday, but wouldn't think that it might be on their own doorstep. And a site like this, we're trying to make people aware within the area around that this is what really is on their doorstep. Now, the work with the children, we backed up with some of the staff from Northamptonshire Archaeology, and there are a number of Roman buildings where we can see sort of rectangular areas of floor, hearth areas. Here we've got another rectangular area of floor and a hearth area. These were exposed to a level of plan, but were not further excavated. That work will take place probably over the next 2 or 3 years in the orchard. Here you can see in the plan the buildings. We've got certainly the 2 buildings there, and we found the ends of a number of burials, which were really to presage what came subsequently on this site. Now, we left the orchard alone in the following year because this is one of those sites that's full of received wisdom. And one of the pieces of received wisdom, ignoring the one about tunnels, was that the area of the lower garden had been largely destroyed when in the Victorian period they constructed a lawn tennis court. We were all told there'd be no archaeology there, it had all gone. Being slightly bloody-minded, we arranged a season where we trenched the area, and what we found was that the Roman archaeology survived very well. Instead of destroying all the lower garden, what had happened is they'd removed part of the southern part of the lower garden and dumped it on the northern part. So it was an early cut and fill. They buried numbers of road surfaces and walls and other features, which we identified were present, planned, but didn't further pursue, because slit trenches are all very good for evaluation, but they're not very good for understanding. So we left them alone. We also carried out an excavation to the east of the cottages in the farm, where it was the received wisdom again that there was a deserted medieval village. Now, the earthworks that you can see on the ground there are very unconvincing, and many of them, I think, are probably raked out manure from the agricultural barns. But we opened up a trench, and what we found were a number of metalled surfaces and walls, and also a couple of dozen pieces of early medieval and middling medieval pottery. So I think it is highly likely that the medieval focus is in this area over here, but whether that's where the village is or whether it's slightly further over, at this stage I wouldn't like to say. Now, following on from that and continuing this desire to carry out outreach, we carry out work in 2014 in the orchard again. We opened an area containing the burials. We had a number of students from Leicester University who were with us for 3 weeks as part of their training requirement. And when they'd completed their time with us, we had a further week with one of the local archaeology society from Higham Ferrers. And in that week with the local society, we achieved a huge amount, and we appreciated really that there is a desire and a great will amongst the public to take part in digs and excavations. So in many ways, 2014, we learnt an enormous amount that we then fed into our programme going forward. Now, going forward, 2015, what we did is we opened a large part of the orchard area up. We invited the great British public to come along and dig. And every day we had between 20 and 25 people taking part in excavation, excavating skeletons, cleaning surfaces, washing pottery and bone. And the atmosphere on site was just electric. It was just wonderful to have so many people there actually enjoying it, unlike people who work at units who sometimes are slightly jaded, and for many of them it's very much a job. These were people who were inquisitive. They were questioning, they wanted to learn, and they really were enjoying it. They didn't want to stop at the end of some of the days. So we had a great excavation then, and uncovered quite a lot of very exciting results. Now, in terms of Irchester, one of the things that excites me most, oops, sorry, going the wrong way again, previous. It was easier with the old slide projector button. You knew which way you were going. Now, Irchester, we have this whole town and suburb. And as an archaeologist, I always think the most interesting things are not the things you find. I get fed up being asked by people, what's the best thing you've ever found? The most exciting thing is understanding the site and thinking about the site. And the exciting thing for me as an archaeologist with Irchester is I've been involved in the site for, over 20 odd years. And I've been involved on Roman towns really since the early 1980s. So I have a long pedigree of looking at towns. And I think the exciting thing is working out how they sat within their landscape. These things must have descended like a flying saucer. You know, there were no real towns before the Roman conquest. So understanding how these things existed in their own landscape, how they interacted with it, and how they impacted on it is one of the most interesting questions you could have. Now, as fate would have it, directly to the south of Irchester, I spent the best part of 10 years excavating gravel quarries. And within those gravel quarries, we had extensive evidence of Romano-British agriculture. We had dispersed villas. There's a villa at Great Doddington, there's one at Wollaston, and there's another one at Little Irchester. So we have villas, we have lower grade Roman farmsteads, we have field system, and we have a whole range of agricultural produce reflected in the archaeological record, cereals and all sorts of things like that. And I think that when you find that in association with a town, what you start to then think is, oh yeah, this town was almost certainly a collection place. Where would these farming people would have paid their taxes and dues? You know, they almost certainly will have come to Irchester as an administrative centre. They may equally have gone to Irchester to get their exotic products. You know, Irchester would have been a very significant central place for them. Not just that, it may have also influenced the agriculture that was carried out. I've mentioned Anicius Saturninus, our Strator. Well, if he's buying horses, one of the things horses need is fodder. And whilst you can graze them on the floodplain when it's not flooded, during the winter months, you almost certainly would have needed a food supply to support the livestock. Now, one of the bits of evidence we had from Wollaston was a well. And in that well, we had hundreds of one particular type of beetle. Now, that beetle happened at the larval stage to live in plantains. And Professor Mark Robinson, who carried out the environmental report on the samples from that well, said the only way you'd have got that number of that beetle in that well would have been if there'd been a haystack right next to it. So what we think is perhaps large parts of the floodplain area during the summer may have been cultivated as hay meadow. And these haystacks may themselves have provided the fodder for livestock, horses and other animals through the winter. But, you know, that's the nature of invisible archaeology. You know, we wouldn't have seen a haystack, but we find a well with these beetles in. You just imagine how upset they were as they ran around trying to find another plantain to lay their eggs in, and they suddenly fell down a deep, dark, wet hole and drowned. Anyway, so horses, haystacks, and Wollaston, you know, how far was this countryside providing what the town needed? And that's doubly so with this particular monument. This is something that, you know, if I was proud of something, it's this. It's the fact that we identified the first proven Roman vineyard in Britain, because we actually had the pollen. At Wollaston, we had a vineyard that was made of a whole series of these parallel trenches, pastinatio trenches. In total, we excavated over 6 kilometres of them. Talk about a labour of love. That would have held getting on for 4,000 vines. And this is the figure I particularly like. That in itself would have, using sort of eco vineyard production levels as opposed to industrial vineyard production levels, that would have produced 15,000 bottles of wine. That'd keep me going, just about. That's 2,300 gallons for anybody who wants it in a different figure. Now, these parallel rows of trenches, what we had were the root balls for the individual vines and the posts to support them along the edge. And just to show you how we didn't just get the answer straight away, we went through various permutations. Were these ditches drainage channels? No, because none of them drained anywhere. Were they irrigation channels? Again, no, they didn't work. We even went through the possibility of were these cultivation trenches for celery? And I had a wonderful put down letter from an Oxford academic before we had the proof of the vineyard, saying it's perhaps harder to imagine this area as a celery cultivation than it is to imagine it as a vineyard. Were this the Po Valley, I'd have no problem seeing it as a vineyard. And literally within weeks, we got the pollen proving vitis. Now, our vineyard trenches are spaced at about 5 metres, and from the environmental data we got, we didn't just get pollen and vitis, we got other plants. The only weeds growing here were weeds of bare ground. So it's highly likely that the ground between each row of vines was kept bare. Here you can see the vineyard, there's the villa there, and then you've got the farm in this area. Now, this photograph took longer to get than you might think. You may think that's just a throwaway image. The spacing between the rows is 5 meters, which is huge. If you go abroad, the spacing between the rows is normally, a couple of meters, 2 to 2.5 meters, big enough to get a tractor or a cart down, but no wider. So why would these vines be so far apart? What we think and what we believe, given the evidence for the weeds of bare ground, is that they actually kept the ground bare between the rows, so that when the sun shone, that rare day in England, it warmed the ground up and the heat was given off like a night storage heater, warming the vines up. Now, if this area had got grass over it, it wouldn't have that same ability to absorb the heat from the sun. And what you can see here is this ranging rod is 2 meters tall. That's about as high as a vine could grow, and you still be able to harvest it without any special equipment like a ladder. So if our vineyard grew with vines on trellises about 2 meters or 6 foot high, they would cast a shadow that would fall just short in September of the next row over. And I think that's good agricultural practice. Somebody looking at it thinking, well, if we keep the sun so that the shadows never fall on the next row, you're going to optimize your sugar production within the grapes and therefore the alcohol in the wine. So I think that's a good piece of local agriculture. And it's not the only vineyard. We've now suggested that there are several other vineyards in Grendon. This particular one was found north of Wellingborough. And about 2 years ago, I was involved in a further excavation at Earls Barton, slightly to the west of Irchester, where a further vineyard, again with pastonatio cultivation trenches, was found. So I think viticulture is one of the big industries in this area. And the big question is, what area did this wine provide? Because although I said the one we excavated produced 15,000 bottles of wine, when you actually think about it, that's not that many within a large population. So, it's possible that these vineyards weren't an export industry for wine. They may have been supplying this part of the East Midlands, maybe just the Nene Valley, and other vineyards may have been elsewhere. I think one of the things is that people don't necessarily look, and sadly, pollen doesn't generally survive to confirm what one has. Now, we actually have looked at some of the villas around. I got a student who did geophysics on one of the Roman villas. We were looking to see if we could find a pressing floor or a treading floor. We couldn't find one that we could identify from geophysics, but then why would we find one? I went to a wedding in Vienna a number of years ago, and this picture particularly struck me. When you look at it, they're harvesting the grapes, and here you can see they're treading the grapes in a half barrel. And it's quite possible that our vineyard at Wollaston would have had the grapes harvested, and the treading to get the grape juice may well have been in something as organic as a barrel. I think that sometimes we expect huge structures. Something like the wine press from the Villa of the Mysteries would have been nice, but I think here we're probably looking at something much more rustic, fit for purpose, but much harder to find archaeologically. And so I think perhaps a half barrel may have been what they trod the grapes in. Now, I go on holiday abroad in a motorhome quite a lot, and this was one of those things that I wasn't actually looking for or even thinking about, but I was in France one April. I came out of my motorhome, it was in rural France, and all of a sudden, all I could smell was wood smoke. And for whatever reason, I suddenly thought, Christ, this is what Roman Britain probably smelt like. When you look around France, they have huge piles of firewood everywhere. And when I came back from my holiday, I started thinking, well, I wonder if anybody's actually looked at it. And there has been some research into firewood in the Roman world. There have been calculations of all sorts of things. There's been calculations about how much firewood would be yielded per hectare. There are estimates about how much firewood is needed by a person in a developing world context. And what I did is I took what we know about Irchester. We've got an estimated population of 600 to 700 for the town, so probably about 150 households. And I took that and I factored it up through the various elements. So if we think we've got 700 people times the 1.6 tons, we end up at 1,120 tons. Now, when you divide that by the production level, that comes in at nearly 3 square kilometres, just to provide firewood for this one town. And that's not including firewood for a bathhouse. That's not including firewood for hypercaust heating with any of the buildings. That's not including firewood or charcoal for any of the industrial activities on the site. So just think how much of that landscape that we look at archaeologically and we go, oh, it's blank. There are no crop marks. There's no pottery. Think what that blankness might mean. It might actually be a very important product, firewood, enabling these places to simply function. You know, imagine just acres and acres of managed woodland. And then imagine also the woodland needed for structural timbers, timber for buildings, timber for carts. And of course, I had to put it in, timber for wine barrels. Although there is this huge hang-up in the Roman world that wines moved in amphorae, if you go to Germany and parts of France, what you'll see are enormous barrels for moving wine around. Think of those carvings from Trier showing huge barrels on boats. Why would they need to make amphorae in Britain? Why not simply make barrels? It's a much more North European way of moving fluids around. Now, Irchester, we've carried out excavation works around the farmstead. We've carried out these little pinpricks within the scheduled area. But one of the things that we have, and one of the things we do know about the site, is we have cemeteries here, which was found when they constructed the car park off Claudius Way. We have a cemetery over here, which was found during ironstone quarrying in the 19th century. We have a cemetery along here, along Lime Avenue, which was revealed during the work to improve the access into the site back in, trying to remember the date now, but back when that access was being improved in 2014-15. And we have a further cemetery in the area of the Orchard. So we've got 4 cemeteries, all of which are ostensibly late 4th century cemeteries. Now, one of the problems is late 4th century cemetery is one of those glib phrases that we use for regularly laid out burials, generally without grave goods and generally not cutting each other, which is true for all of these. But it seems that it's a bit unusual, or you find it hard to imagine that you'd have all of these cemeteries functioning at the same time. And I do wonder whether some of our cemeteries may actually be one of our best ways of identifying our post-Roman activity. One of the things that we would like to do scientifically is carry out some radiocarbon dating on some of these skeletons and see if, instead of being classic late 4th century, some of these are actually 5th century, something which is quite well known in the southwest. So it will be interesting to test them. What do our bodies look like? Well, we have large numbers of babies, adults. This particular one, I nicknamed him Windy Miller. He'd got half a millstone on either side of his head. They're all quite shallow, generally without any grave goods. Generally, they don't cut each other, but because they're shallow, a lot of them have suffered from plough damage. But there's huge numbers of children, and this particular kist here had 2 or 3 baby burials in it, almost as though there was a special area for burying newborn infants. We had one interesting burial who'd got a hole drilled into the top of his head. It's not an archaeologist with a pick. It generally was a medicinal practice to try and help him through something, whether it's epilepsy or some other ailment. But what we can say is, by the sharpness of these edges, he didn't live, the bones never healed and fused over, so his illness didn't kill him. It was actually the cure that killed him. And like all good late Roman burial areas, we've got a decapitated burial. Unlike the normal east-west burials, this one was interestingly buried north-south. And again, we'd like to carry out a radiocarbon date to see if this one is earlier than the bulk of the cemetery. You know, why is this one north-south orientation, all the rest east-west? We really don't know. But decapitated burials, always fun to find. I think one of the mistakes people make is, because it's decapitated, is to apply a squeamish desire to have it as execution or whatever. I personally believe these are simply a removal of the head from the body as a way of releasing spirits. The Romans were hideously superstitious, and one of the things that we know from other cultures is they believed the quicker the body was broken or destroyed, usually by cremation, the quicker the spirit was able to go off to the afterlife. Here you can see an overall view, a high-level camera view of the burials. We've carried out further excavation. They're not quite in perfect rows, but they do seem to be quite managed, and the burials continue in this area at the top of the screen. And there's the decap. You can see he's very obviously on the wrong way round. Now, the great thing of working with volunteers is that many of these volunteers develop the same love and fascination with archaeology that I have. And with the development of the site, what we found was a lot of the volunteers developed the skills and absolutely perfected the skills needed by field archaeologists. So when the development and the redevelopment of the site was proposed, what we arranged first of all was to carry out an archaeological trial trench evaluation as part of the planning process, and we carried that out in 2015 and 16 with myself and the volunteers we'd trained in the summer excavation. They turned out, they excavated the trenches, we recovered some nice stuff. It's always the great thing of archaeology when you find nice stuff. One pit produced a fragment of a hexagonal glass bottle, a bone hairpin, and this rather fine mandolin spoon. And other stuff that was a bit more surprising. This was a rather small grotty piece of copper alloy, which I thought was probably a very nasty late Roman coin until I looked under the magnifying glass and suddenly realized that, oh dear, it's our evidence for the pagan Saxons. As a scale, you can see this 1 penny on the side. It's tiny, it's about the size of your little fingernail, but it is the only piece of metalwork from this period that we've found to date. And it came from the top part of the site, near to where the ark is now standing. Now, I just want to show you the site. Now, the orchard excavation's over here. We carried out excavations in the lower garden, which I'll show you in a minute. But the mitigation works that we've carried out entirely with volunteers covered this whole area up here, all the way through these circular hobbit houses, removal of this Nissen hut barn, the footprint of this barn, which is where the new archaeological resource centre is situated, the insides of all these structures, the covered barns, the pigsties and all the rest of it, and also the whole of what we call the 100-metre trench coming down and the lower courtyard. And without the volunteers that took part, we would never have been able to achieve it. And I think this aerial view is a very good way of appreciating just the area that we've encompassed with the work we've done to date. Now, the volunteers came, we spent 3 weeks happily cleaning the road down to the house. We have excellent results, including the inevitable nightmare of a Roman well right in the middle of the road. We had people cleaning wheel ruts, thank you, Francis. We had people digging ditches. We found down in this area elements of garden features that relate to this house in the form of tree root bowls. We found elements of a medieval building, presumably the medieval building that predated this structure, which is 17th century. We had pits and Roman roadside ditches. So we uncovered a huge amount of information in this area. And just in the gateway that you can't see just in here, we found part of a circular stone building, which we weren't really thinking about. We weren't expecting. And at the time, I wondered whether it might be the remains of a medieval dovecote. And what we've come to realize is the medieval structures on this site generally seem to be of ironstone, which is the local native freestone they can quarry. So I think that this limestone circular building may be the remains of yet another Romano-Celtic shrine. Sadly, when we dug it, we again didn't get any votive objects. But people came in all sorts of weathers, all sorts of times. This is a bank holiday weekend, and we had people digging ironstone quarry pits, the remains of 19th century chicken houses. We had all sorts of interesting features. The pit that produced the spoon and so on was just over there. We opened these areas. We excavated this large area of ironstone quarrying. Thank you, Bruce. I saw you were in the room earlier. Huge hole, not a great deal of finds from it, but yeah, access was interesting, I think is the best way of putting it. What they were quarrying the ironstone for, we don't know, whether it was building material or whether it was for metalworking or whether it was just for hardcore. But those quarry pits were quite localized, quite a small area. We had 2 Roman wells in total, one that was in the road corridor and one that was in that back area with the ironstone quarrying. And what we did is we commissioned Oxford East to carry out the excavation and the reporting on them. They excavated them carefully. And from one of the wells, we had clues to another industry going on in the area. Traces from the bones that were recovered, suggesting that there was perhaps tanning going on, leatherworking. So we pieced together all sorts of pieces of information. But ironically, although I said to people, oh, there'll be a shoe at the bottom, 2 Roman wells, and there wasn't a shoe in either of them, which for those of you that have dug Roman wells know there's always a shoe down the bottom. It's almost though they have to lose one before they put a sign up saying, careful, don't lose your shoe. Anyway, so in terms of the wells, we got information. In terms of the site, generally we worked in all weathers. Unlike archaeology that you see on the television, which is always nice blue skies, the volunteers came out in the glorious winter weather. And at this stage, we had builders on the site who would regularly say, you know, why are you all so happy? You're not even being paid. But we were excavating the remains of a post-medieval cottage, believe it or not. The snow didn't last all the time, but that wind was biting cold. We found evidence of various Roman activities, pottery kilns. This rather distinctive keyhole shape is all that survived of one of the 2 pottery kilns we've found so far on the site. We found the remains of a malting oven. I refuse to call these corn drying ovens. I think a malting oven's much more interesting, especially since it will be associated with the making of ale, a much more appealing prospect than just a loaf of bread. We found more road networks. This is part of a Roman side road coming through. And what we've managed from the mitigation works is we've identified this road coming through here, through the rest of the site. We've identified this road coming through as well. We've identified pottery kilns there. There's a well there. There's ironstone quarrying here. The malting ovens over there. We've identified a whole range of buildings fronting along on this road. So literally in the footprint of these buildings, a series of Roman buildings that fronted onto it. So we're getting quite a good picture of a Roman suburb. And, hi John, we have this, one of those embarrassing features. This is a roadside burial. The skull is just lurking here. And because it was associated with unworn jewellery, unworn bangles, we presumed it was possibly the burial of a young girl, a teenage girl, who hadn't yet reached womanhood, and as a result, the jewellery was placed in the grave with her. Well, the bones came back, and the analysis of the skull showed that all the teeth sockets, the teeth had come out and the voids had fused over. So I think we're probably looking at a gummy old lady in this instance. But she was buried with unworn jewellery and with a couple of pots, which, as you can see, John was very pleased to find. Now, as well as the mitigation works, we've tried to run a summer training dig each year. And we excavated the lower garden. Having carried out that trenching a number of years previously, we carried out the excavation of the lower garden in 2017, opening just a little area. I still remember various people coming close to the spoil heap, standing on top of it and looking over them and going, oh God, that's a big patch. Well, there's no point doing archaeology if you're only going to play with little trenches. So we opened as much as we possibly could. The only limiting factor was where the spoil could go. So we opened up a large area. We had the remains of a Roman side road. We had the remains of further buildings fronting on the Roman road that actually ran along in this area. And we had also, quite excitingly, our only bit of what I'd call real Iron Age, a ring ditch, which was lurking just in here. There was, however, stuff that I grew up calling Belgic, but we're no longer allowed to call it that, late pre-Roman Iron Age, from a number of ditches that ran across this part of the site, and there were also some early brooches recovered. Now, what did we get from this area? Well, we had lots of people come along. We cleaned it, we loved it, we observed garden buildings, buildings that were related to the 17th century farm and that appear on a map of the 18th century. There's one building in here, and there's another building that was lurking in here that's only known or only shown on a 19th century drawing. So we had foundations of, post-medieval structures that we would have found no other trace of. We had elements of garden footpaths, but the most exciting was the Roman. Now, in terms of the Roman site, we had buildings with pitch stone walls and floor levels. We had areas that we knew had buildings in it, but because of the site being ploughed and because stone had been robbed out, they were very difficult to disentangle. And so we carried out detailed cleaning over this area. And what we were able to do from that detailed cleaning was to identify where the wall lines had been. Some of these wall lines were where we got short sections of faced masonry. Some of the wall lines were where we could see the edge of a scorched site, a fire site, that had got a very straight edge, indicating there had been a wall against which the fire had been burning. So here, in the corner of this lower garden, we have a multi-roomed Roman building that's much larger than the usual strip structures. What its role was, what its function was, we don't know. We didn't fully excavate it. We, however, got a full plan, and the aim was to try and get a full plan of this area so it could be reinstated as lawn, so that with the redevelopment of the site, it would be possible for people getting their tea and cake from the cafe to enjoy nice surroundings. But I wanted to make sure we had the archaeological information at least to a base level. What else did we get? Well, this is one of the Roman buildings we had that was just here in the angle of the Roman road. And around that, we found a number of droplets of bronze. This is the base of a hearth. This sort of tile base here is the base of a hearth. There's other hearths within the building. And I wonder if this is a metalworking workshop. Whether it's purely bronze or whether it's just a mixture of metals, we don't know. But again, it's another aspect to this site that we wouldn't have got without excavation. Now, the view you've got on the right-hand side is our Roman road, which comes down from the orchard through into the lower garden and down and links up with the east-west road towards Higham Ferrers. There's at least 2 road surfaces, which we exposed, we cleaned parts of, but we left most of the road in situ. And the bit where it's missing here is where the site had been scalped in order to do the levelling of the garden for the tennis court. So we have a bit of road, but then we have a huge chunk where the road had been destroyed or removed. And after we completed our excavation, the soil was duly put back, and you'd never know we'd been. Well, you might know we'd been, but we tried to make it as inconspicuous as possible. Now, unfortunately, in terms of continued excavation, we had plans for an excavation, but the need to be cost neutral meant 1 year we had about 4 weeks, and we wouldn't be able to secure funding in that time. So we carried out an excavation with Leicester University students in 2019, I believe it was. Yeah, 2019, and we had glorious English weather. Just the sort of weather that you all want to do archaeology in. You look out and your site's a pond. It didn't, however, stop us. There were enough dry days, but we focused our attention on a chunk of the orchard, trying to complete the excavation of the burials and also some of the associated features, various ditches, various pits and so on. Now, what did we have? Well, we had a large number of people for a start. Very keen to make sure we have as many people as possible from as many backgrounds. So we've got Jeremy Taylor, who some of you know there. We have some students from Leicester. We have some of our volunteers. We engaged with, a wide demographic. And again, it was really quite interesting because students at university often think that having a degree makes them archaeologists. So getting them working with amateurs who'd actually got a year's experience was a really good experience for them. They learned both ways. So I think it was one of those really nice things. We had a great atmosphere. What did we find? Well, we found, first of all, this, an apron of gravel coming down from the southern of the two roads that heads out to Higham Ferrers, and it seems to act as a sort of driveway, for want of a better term, to access the cemetery off that road. We found also the continuation of our Roman side road with a Roman building alongside it, but also a post-medieval building with a post-medieval drain that we didn't even expect to see. We didn't know it was there. So this year, in the excavations in June and possibly into July, we're hoping to better understand this area, as obviously it holds the key to elements of the site that we'll get no other way than by excavation. So, really, in conclusion, this is the site, Chester Farm, or as it's been rebranded, the Chester House Estate, before the buildings got demolished and replaced. We've carried out a large excavation covering most of this footprint that you can see. We understand a huge swathe of the suburb of Roman Irchester. I think from what we can understand, we know what's likely to be in the land around. It gives us a very good picture for understanding some of the other aspects of the landscape, some of the other areas that we haven't excavated yet. The site now here has the new Archaeological Resource Centre. In this building, there's going to be the Interpretation Centre and education facilities. In this building here, there are the public toilets, always a key thing to mention with any heritage asset. In this building, there will be a cafe. This is the threshing barn, which will be a lecture venue, an events venue for weddings and all sorts. There's going to be a number of artisan outlets within the other buildings of the courtyard. So the site will hopefully come back alive, and hopefully people will come to this site. Completion is due, and the site is due to be open, I believe, from this autumn. So hopefully people will be able to access this site and enjoy it and look at the Roman landscape around them, and also look and consider some of the other aspects of the site. Because although archaeology is very good and geophysics is very good, the only way really to understand this site is to go and stand there, take part in some of the work on the site and ask the questions. We would never have 10 years ago been able to tell you that we had tanning on this site. We would never have considered the impact of this site on the landscape for firewood. We would never have understood some of the other things, some of the quirky bits that come out. And one of the bones that's come from the site, from one of the Roman trenches, was the bone of a carp. So quite clearly they were eating fish out of the river. So, you know, we have learnt so much about this site in a period of sort of 10, 15 years. And hopefully the next 10 to 15 years, we'll know even more. And my ambition or my hope is, please, let's find its name. It's all well and good calling it Irchester, but it's lovely to know what its real name is. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that.